Okay, welcome in the premises of the International Institute for Peace. My name is SWOBODA. I'm president of this institute, and I want to welcome you here. And thank you very much for FIRE for co-organizing or mainly organizing, and we are the co-organizer of this event tonight. The International Institute for Peace is since many years already engaged in the Ukraine issue. Interesting enough, in the last 2 years before, now February, before the turn of the year, the attention and the interest in the Ukraine issue was declining. It's a bad sign that sometimes there is occupation, there is stability in the occupation, and people are less interested until, unfortunately, a very dreadful and horrible war was started by Putin's Russia. We made it from the beginning clear that there is one responsible, not two sides responsible, there's one responsible, and this is the aggressor who started the war. And of course, we all are interested to stop the war, but the difficulty is how to stop a war and at the same time to create or represent or create some sort of justice when such a horrible war has been started. Nevertheless, our institute, as I said, is interested in peace. But peace sometimes, unfortunately, this is a lesson we have to learn again, needs to some force in order to stop the war. If on the other side there is a dictator who is not interested in dialogue, in compromise, but just in occupation and extension, his personal power and the power of the country he represents. Thank you very much for coming, and I personally have been quite often in Ukraine. We also, as an institute, we organized together with our institute in Istanbul several times neighborhood events in Odessa, and this is a city which I'm very closely, also emotionally, because I've been very often there many years ago already. And when we see how the new Ukraine, which was developing with all the difficulties, with all problems of corruption and whatever, but was developing a democracy with different opinions, different attitudes. And this is crushed by somebody who is not allowing at home different opinions and alternatives. Then it's a very sad event we have to see. And it's not only, and this is my last sentence because you have to have the discussion, it's not only about Ukraine, it's also about Europe, about what kind of Europe we want, what kind of Europe we are fighting for in whatever kind we are fighting. And we thought it is enough if we fight with our language, with our thoughts, with our writings. But unfortunately, it seems not enough to fight with this kind of peaceful instruments, but with the force and with the armies. Again, thank you very much for coming, and I wish you all a very fruitful discussion. We'll not be happy because the subject is not happy, but a very open and honest discussion. And again, thank you very much for coming into our premises. Please. I hand over to the moderator.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you and the International Institute for Peace. Good evening from my side, everybody. My name is Özge. I'm one of the co-founders of FIRE, of the Forum for Interdisciplinary Rhetorics and Expertise, but most people know it by FIRE. And we're really happy that so many of you chose to join us today. I will be leading you through today's event, which is, as most of you probably know, called Ukraine, a centuries-long struggle for independence and sovereignty. And before we start off, I'll have to preface the evening by explaining the format within which the event will unfold. And so the first part will consist of the inputs of our three experts who are seated right here, and to whom I will introduce you in a bit. And all three of our experts come from different fields of specialization and will provide you with their own insights, knowledge, and experiences. And after this, these inputs, I will introduce the second part, and I will announce the open discussion round, which we call the fishbowl, kind of. And as you see, we have a few empty seats here. We have 3 empty seats, and those are actually meant for you. So when you're here, I will give you the opportunity to ask any and all questions you may have regarding this topic, and we would kindly invite you to engage in the dialogue as well. And however, because we want to give as many people as possible the chance to speak up and contribute their voices to the discussion, I would kindly ask all of you to be mindful, and if you've already been seated a while and kind of been able to make your statements and pose your questions, and then you see that other people want to come forward and take a seat and contribute as well, then I would just ask you to make place for them and return to your original seats. So now that we all know how this is going to play out, I can finally come around to introducing our guests. First, I want to introduce Volodymyr ISHCHENKO, who has come all the way from Berlin, and where he is a research fellow at the Institute of the East European Studies. And among many, many other things, he has been studying social movements, protests, radicalism, both left and right, and he has authored countless peer reviews, articles, and interviews on Ukrainian politics. I personally have read your articles in Al Jazeera, in The Guardian, and your most recent interview in the New Left review, which is called Towards the Abyss, and I wholeheartedly recommend everyone to read them too. Thank you for being here. Our second guest is Hanna Kravchenko. She grew up, studied, and worked in Ukraine up until very recently. She graduated as a translator and worked for the Rokata Charitable Foundation in Kyiv, where she helped refugees to integrate in Ukraine. Today, tragically, she herself is one of the many millions of Ukrainians affected by the war and has a deeply personal understanding of the psychological, social, and emotional consequences. She had to leave her country to now be in Austria, and I just want to say a big welcome to you, Hanna. And last but certainly not least, we have Stefan Scheucher, who is a correspondent for various media in Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and of course in Austria, where he writes, for instance, for Der Standard and Datum. And previously he worked at the foreign desk at Kurier for many, many years, where he specialized in Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. And prior to the pandemic and the war, he visited Ukraine regularly and even visited and reported from the Donetsk region in May 2014, right when the establishment of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics was attempted to be legitimized. And thank you so much for being with us today, Stefan. Now I want to get right into the event, and without any further ado, first we will be listening to Volodymyr, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Oscar, for introducing us and for inviting me here. I always love to be in Vienna, but it's always like for a very short time. I'll be speaking about the most typical question that people are asking today: why this whole war has started, and I'll just try to present my view in about like 10 minutes, and hopefully I'll manage this because it's a complicated question. But I'll just to make it more simple. Many people actually do not want to make sense about this war, and the words like madman's war, insane war, crazy war, irrational war, actually very typical if you read the articles about trying to decipher Putin's decision, and there is a revival in the interests of the Russian imperial ideology, which is also seen as something like a false consciousness, like something that blinds the people in the Russian ruling clique that started this war that looks like it is actually going against their own interests. If you look how badly the Russian army performed in the first 2 months of the war, that they first tried to attack Kiev, then they retreated from the Kiev, then they left those like horrible atrocities in the Kiev suburbs, totally discrediting the Russian army and Russia itself, and the narrative goes also about these changes with Putin that happened during the COVID pandemic, that he was allegedly isolated and not speaking to almost no one except a very, very, very small circle of people with very freaky, obscure ideas, reading some reactionary philosophers like the beginning of the 20th century with some fascist sympathies, like Ilian, for example, and meeting the people at this insanely huge table. So that's, of course, it goes into the narrative that this is actually just a crazy idea of one dictator who just went totally mad and started the war against his own interests. I would say that, I mean, if there is any element of truth in this narrative, it would be actually very puzzling, at least in the context of what we really know about how the politics in Russia and in the whole post-Soviet space was going on for all the 30 years after the Soviet Union collapse. Because it has never been a politics of ideological fanaticism. Now people are speaking about fascism in Russia. Fascism is a little bit more than just attacking a small country by a big country. That's mobilizationist parties, that's a paramilitary movement, that's strongly ideological politics, that's like Hitler writing a book in a prison. That's nothing like this. It actually describes how the politics in Russia worked, or in Ukraine, or in any other post-Soviet countries. The politics in the post-Soviet countries was like the opposite to ideological fanaticism. That was cynical, pragmatic politics done by the people without any ideas, thinking primarily about the money and power and the interests of their cliques, of the loyal patron clientelistic networks. The politics of very weak parties, nothing like NSDAP, nothing like Italian fascists, the parties of sheer opportunist careerists, weak civil society that notoriously weak, and even not just in Russia, but actually in Ukraine as well. And this is very different one, and we actually can make more sense in this war if we accept this reality that this war is not about some fanatical ideology, it's rather about the crisis of ideology, or I would call it like the crisis of hegemony. I like Gramsci, and I try to analyze post-Soviet politics in this Gramscian perspective. The crisis of the capacity of post-Soviet ruling class, specifically in Russia, to actually articulate any developmental project and to present their own interests at the interests of some broader groups within Russian or other post-Soviet societies, or in extreme as the national interests. The people who actually became the ruling class in the post-Soviet societies, they formed in the process of the Soviet collapse, in the process of stealing from the disintegrating Soviet state. That's how they became insanely rich in the beginning of the 90s. And if you think about this we may call them political capitalists. The capitalists who make their profits and make their wealth from exploiting the state, from exploiting political offices. Not because they have some advanced technology that provides some competitive advantage in the markets. Not because they actually exploit the cheap labor force, like other groups of capitalists. No, these capitalists were primarily building their wealth from stealing from the disintegrating Soviet state. And if you think about the rational interests of this kind of people, that's in their core interest to sustain their monopoly control over the state. And that's where all this sovereignty talk by Putin is coming from. That's why he's saying that we, and he's speaking on behalf of the Russian ruling clique, or we may also say Russian ruling class, we must have like sovereign control over Russia, not allow any of those Western foundations coming to Russia and starting to teach us democracy, fighting against corruption, because actually corruption is in their very core interests. Corruption is actually exploitation of the selective preferences from the state and making them their competitive advantage against other groups of capitalists. And that we, the Russian ruling class, we need as kind of like a sovereign sphere of influence. And that's all coming from this, not from some fanatical ideology, but from their rational class interests. And understanding this, we may make more sense in why this whole war has started. So we could actually look at the crisis of ideology, the crisis of hegemony on the three levels, and how the rational interests of this Russian ruling class are working on these three levels. So on the global level, they not only Putin is speaking about the threat of NATO expansion, the threat of like Ukrainian Nazis or whatever, but actually the current situation presents for them an opportunity, because the crisis of hegemony is not only in the post-Soviet space, it's globally. More and more people in the world are believing less and less in the United States. And the West is currently like united around the United States and support for Ukraine. But if you look how like the countries are voting in the United Nations, you would see much more divergence. China, like, it's almost openly in support of Russia, but also India and many African countries, Latin American countries. So the global South is not, it doesn't see this as their own war. And those countries actually represent a very large part of the humanity. And the domestic crisis in the Western countries, the rise of the populists, the attack on the capital last year in the United States, something completely unprecedented. The talk about the weakening of the power, the Brexit, the threat of Le Pen in France, and so on and so forth. That's actually, it's an opportunity to change the world order in the interests of the Russian ruling clique, or at least to expand some space for them in order to assert their, what they see as sovereign interest in that part of the world. So it's not just about threats on the global level. It's also about the opportunities to expand the power, expand the control over the processes that allow them to be rich and to accumulate power. On the regional level, on the post-Soviet level, it's also about the crisis of hegemony, because it's about the lack of any attractive project for other countries in the Soviet peripheries. Why they need to start the war against Ukraine? Because they cannot attract Ukraine. They do not possess the soft power in the post-Soviet space. And when you don't have a soft power, you may rely on the hard power, on the power of the brutal violence. And also on the, yeah, I'm just finishing. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Just a few last points. It's also the crisis of hegemony on the domestic level, because that kind of the political regimes, like Putin's regime, like Lukashenko's regime, they prove to be very unstable. We've seen like Lukashenko, for example, ruling Belarus since 1994, or like Nazarbayev ruling Kazakhstan since 1986, if I'm not mistaken. 35 years, and like the whole generation was raised under these dictators. But suddenly we see massive uprisings against Lukashenko in 2020, against Kazakhstan regime just this January, completely unprecedented. Many political scientists would not even expect such kind of uprisings in those countries. They would expect something like this in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, where there have been some revolutions, but not in the countries like Lukashenko, like Belarus or Kazakhstan or Russia, which looked like consolidated dictatorships, which would not allow massive movements against them. But it looks like this kind of regimes are fundamentally unstable. They are weak. They cannot solve this problem of successor. Who would succeed Putin when he'll become just physically incapable to rule Russia? And that successor should not be smart enough to remove Putin before his death. So it's actually a very difficult problem, how to leave the dictatorship position if you rule the countries for 20, 30 years. It's not easy. And the war actually presents, again, an opportunity for Putin to do some fundamental changes in how Russian economy, politics, and ideology works, and make a Russian regime more ideological, more mobilizationist, to remove the pro-Western part of the Russian elite. We know that over 200,000 of Russians have left the country since the war started and all the massive sanctions were imposed on Russia. And these were actually the people more like pro-Western, more like oppositionist, more like liberal, anti-war. And of course this removes some of the dangers that Putin had in its own country. Putin consolidates the elite around him. So he actually is building a stronger regime thanks to the war. And so we need to understand the war, not some just ideological blunder, but as a realization of the rational collective interests of the Russian ruling class. And that's actually very important to how this war can proceed later and what we can do about this war. If Putin's legitimacy relied primarily on the claim that he brought stability to Russian people during the post-Soviet collapse, now by his own actions, he destroys this stability. And, but at the same time, if Russia somehow would be able to withstand the impact of the sanctions, the possible defeats in Ukraine, we would see a very different Russia, fundamentally different, with very different regime, economy, and ideology. And that would require a completely different strategy how to make changes in Russia. Not that those that were tried in the 1990s and 2000s, but something much more ideological, revolutionary, and more serious. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your inputs. And we're looking forward to listen to many more of your inputs during the open discussion part. So I'm gonna move just right on to our second part with Hanna, and whenever you're ready.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah. So, hello everyone. I'm Hannah and I'm from Ukraine. I won't say that I'm a refugee, but rather a displacement person because I do not plan to stay here. I'm planning to get back to my country when we're gonna win. When I was in Ukraine, I've been working with refugees, and we are trying to make our asylum system as perfect as it possible and to help refugees to integrate into Ukrainian society. I really loved my job because I've been as a translator during psychological sessions, and it was really hard to listen to people and to listen to their painful stories and how barbarians can be worse in Afghanistan or Syria or Sudan, Ethiopia, Somali, and so others. But now it's really like a mean joke of life, because I almost in the same situation when my country is on fire. It's like actually that is horrible. All our men, they are trying to defend our territory and do their best. My husband is defending my country, our country, and my relatives, my mom, she's on the occupied territory now. It's like Kherson region. It's the one region which is the closest one to Crimea. What I can say about those Russian troops, they are, I don't know why they came. They don't know why they came. They just trying to take all the harvest. They just trying to take all the meal from people, to take their stuff from their houses, but nothing more. They're trying to take their lives. Why they came? They don't know their purpose, actually. So my experience is, like my story of my experience is just like one of the millions, one of 40 million people, and each person on the territory of Ukraine or outside, we're experiencing the same pain now.
Thanks a lot for your very personal insight on this topic. I appreciate it. You need to turn it on. Oh, okay. Now we'll be moving on to our third expert, and thank you again, Hanna. Stefan, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much. I've been traveling Ukraine since 2003, and I've been experiencing Ukraine as a, so to say, the anti-model to Russia. In Russia there has not, or to Belarus in the beginning actually, there has been a contrary development as far as I see it in Ukraine. When I came to Kiev first, it was 2003. It was a completely different place. It was, there were like a handful of places to go to. There was a very limited public life that very dramatically changed in 2005 and 2004. After the first Maidan, Ukraine became a very loud country, with like intensive political debates. Sometimes really even they seemed almost ridiculous, but very loud and very intense. And when this Maidan 2013, 2014 happened, there was one phenomenon that I experienced or that I witnessed, that was that almost all these debates just stopped. They just stopped. And there was one aim to focus on. It was like this Maidan, as I've seen it, I would describe it, was a big compromise on certain values. that have been violated and that have been treated with feet and bullied, and the whole country sort of, or a huge part of the country, not the whole country, but a huge part of the country united behind these values. And that was an incredible thing to see. The main language on Maidan was Russian. But what Ukraine has shown to me was that there is a civil society and there is an emerging civil society, while the civil society actually has been silent in Russia, or has been silenced in Russia increasingly. So it's, as far as I have witnessed it, a complete contrary development. When I was traveling to Donbass in 2014 and I've been talking to people there was some sort of anger, there was some sort of disappointment, and there was dissatisfaction with what was happening in Ukraine or what was happening in Kiev or in other parts of the country. But there was nothing like a separatism. These were not people who would have been, as far as I would say, able to shoot at others. This was pushed from outside, and it would not have been happening if this wouldn't have been pushed from outside. When Russia attacked Ukraine now, Ukraine was at war for 8 years already. It just became more present for us in Western Europe, and it became also more present for us what kind of sort of problems Ukraine has actually been dealing with since the very beginning of its existence. And this is a corrupted political elite. This is a very, so to say, volatile political elite, volatile to corruption, volatile to outside influences, volatile to Russian influences. And Russia has been playing these elites from the very beginning of Ukraine's independence. We have only realized that, and we have experienced it to a very smaller extent, I would say, and we still are struggling with that. And we only realized that actually there have been misinformation campaigns in Austria or in Europe, in all the other or Western countries. There have been populistic political forces being pushed, and it just kind of became obvious now, maybe more obvious. We could have known it, I would say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stefan, for your input, and thanks again to all three of you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. So now, as I said in the beginning, we've reached the second part of our event today, where we're going to be having an open discussion, where all of you are very welcome to participate and take a seat right here, and to ask your questions, and our experts will be providing their own answers and on whichever aspect of the topic you wish to speak of. So yeah, the floor is now open for discussion, and we're ready for questions. There's always going to have to be a first one. Yeah, you can just come forward. You can just come forward. You don't have to raise your hand. You can just come.
Thank you very much. I'm Murat Hasanov from Azerbaijan. I study at Central European University, so political science is very close topic to me. And before my question or some sort of opinion, I would like to say that, Madam Anna, I really feel how you feel, because in 2020, when there was war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, so my city where I lived, my village was also came under attack. So my sister, my all relatives were there. People who were close to my heart died. So I really feel your pain. And my aunt is in Sumy, so I was in Ukraine, so I'm a little bit emotional. Like, I was in Ukraine once, So I'm a little bit emotional about this issue, and I hope that it will be once and for all will be over. Regarding my question, so I want to ask the possibility of future scenario for Ukraine. I mean, in which way do you think it will go through? Because last time, I think it was yesterday, the U.S. Secretary and Defense Secretary visited Kiev. So I get sense that the U.S. is going to invest more into this fight. So can we see some sort of like Afghanistan? I would not like to say that, but this kind of scenario where like Russia push more and U.S. invests more. And also, I have one more question. Can we relate, like, because you talk about the class, so I also did some research into this. I thought that Soviet Union, when it collapsed, actually in its mindset, actually it's changed some sort of, it became more, how to say, in terms of new institutionalism, we can say that it was more rational institutionalist, because when it was Soviet Empire, it was like also responsible for economic well-being of the periphery. But now it now some sort of, for example, sells weapons to Azerbaijan and Armenia, or like sells some goods to Kazakhstan or Central Asia. So now it somehow relinquishes duties, but how in rationalist term it gets more to, how to say, satisfy its elites. Would you agree with this opinion? Thank you very much. The second one.
Okay. I mean, the future scenarios, now everything is possible. It's not the question about the future of Ukraine, it's the question about the future of the world, because the nuclear war is now on the agenda. And Putin's rhetoric is becoming more and more threatening. I mean, so we now need to think about the future of the world right now. What would happen with Ukraine? It just totally depends on the outcomes of the developments on the battlefield. I mean, there are better people to analyze the military forces, the chances to victory of the Ukrainian or Russian side, but we need to understand that in the next few weeks it would be all about the Russian army advancing and trying to encircle the biggest part of Ukrainian forces in Donbass, and Ukrainian army defending. And who would win, that would fundamentally define the next scenarios. Afghanistan is possible, partition is possible, defeat of the Russian army is also possible. More horrible scenarios like big occupation of Ukraine, also possible. Escalation towards the nuclear war is also possible. And the question about the Soviet Union, unfortunately, I didn't understand it. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that like Soviet Union was actually exploiting its periphery, but it was also responsible for like economic well-being of these countries. It somehow needed to send some money to periphery to keep them afloat. But I think that after Soviet Union collapsed, its elite's mindset changed that, okay, it's better not to invest into this periphery, but we need to keep it, for example, from Western influence and continue to exploit it. And it's just my opinion. And would you agree with this opinion? Or
of course, there are like fundamental differences between the Soviet Union and Putin's Russia. The society is built on quite fundamentally different economic systems. The Soviet Union actually did have ideology. Putin's Russia may acquire one as a result of the war, and that would be very different from the Soviet communist ideology. That would be something of imperialist conservative ideology. It's something that Putin is articulating now, and he is actually articulating in response to some events, in response to the military developments. If you notice that his article about that Ukrainians and Russians are one and a single people appeared only in 2021. Although, like 7 years after Crimea annexation, 7 years after the start of the war in Donbass, only last year he decided that, yeah, now it's time to say something coherent, and not just that Ukraine is not a real country. And that's part of the reasons that, for example, the Russian soldiers are not exactly understanding why they are fighting this war, because there was so little of ideological preparation for the war. And that comes to what I'm trying to explain. If you're trying to think about the war as just like fanatically driven by some crazy ideology, it was not like this. And it just doesn't explain how the Russian soldiers are motivated, how the Russian citizens who are supporting the war are motivated. It's not about the ideology primarily. It's about very different things. But the Soviet Union fundamentally did have a progressive development project that even when the ideology was seen more and more cynically within the Soviet Union itself, in the 70s, in the 80s, less and less people believed in that the Soviet Union is progressing somewhere. But still, the Soviet Union was presenting an attractive force for many movements in many countries in the third world, up to the early 80s at least.
Yeah,
and
actually,
that's very different, of course.
Actually, I agree. That's why I was asked, like, yes, Soviet Union, despite being cruel, invested into modernization project, but I mean, maybe the elites came to conclusions that, okay, it costs too much to us to somehow invest in these countries. It's better just to exploit them and not to invest in them, and it's more beneficial for us. That was actually my question, which you explained to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you guys want to contribute anything to that before we move on to the next question, maybe?
I just have one thing to say. I'm not so sure that that the ideology plays such a minor role in this. I mean, Putin's or Russia's family law that allows domestic violence, basically, I think is from 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And Putin's conservatism that he expands or exports to European countries also is not from the year 2021. So ideology does play a role, I would say.
Thank you so much. So we're going to be moving on to the next question. Thank you for being here.
Should I move back?
I mean, if you're finished, you can take your original seat. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
There was an interesting talk recently in London I was unfortunately not able to attend to, which was about the greater implications of the Ukraine conflict and from a more semi-regional to a much more global issue, which we're now facing. So the Ukraine war is no longer about like this regional kerfuffle between Russia and Ukraine. It pretty much shows the kind of divide that has now taken place over the last recent years between this like kind of Western and Eastern bloc. And I wouldn't be so certain that Ukraine is going to win this war, because there's actually quite a high chance for nuclear usage right now. Because as we speak, Putin needs a win domestically. There is no doubt about it. This war was started as an externalization of its internal problems, because the Russian economy is completely shit. There's no other words describing it. Like, you have a resource-based economy with combined with a huge brain drain. You have an aging population, plus an insane drug addiction in the form of vodka, of course. That's a combination headed for disaster, and it's not sustainable in any way. And so it's a much more an externalization of the pressure, and that ultimately leads you to certain problems, because it leads you to do quote unquote, do irrational things, which are not really irrational. It's much more like we've went down that path, and now I have no other option than to continue. If like the pain is too high to like alleviate some of the problems, because like it's tremendously bigger than over the next 10 years wage this war, and so nukes become much more viable if victory is needed, especially in a short time frame. And that, however, is, especially since we're here at the International Institute of Peace, like nobody wants a nuclear usage, because that would create a whole bandwidth of problems. So what I wanted to say is we need to create a off-ramp for Putin where he can go out as a victor. And that would mean that we have to sacrifice parts of Ukraine for that. That means Russia has to gain certain control over certain regions. Otherwise, the world is going to pay such a heavy price over the long run, which we, as humanity, cannot sustain. We cannot like alleviate this like small little flame and make it a much bigger one, which creates so many problems down the road for peace and security all over the world, just because some idiot doesn't get like 2 minor provinces somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your statement. I think that there is quite a few things to be said for that. Hanna, do you maybe have to say something to that, because you know it's about your country and about giving up?
Well, I'm certainly sure that we do not have to give him a part of our country, because Putin will never be enough. He already took Crimea. He already took the part of Donbass and Lugansk region. So why do we have to give him our territories? In any case, our war will finish, I hope so, with our win. But we're gonna lose a lot of people. We already lost a lot of lives, and they were fighting for their freedom, for their places, for their towns, cities, for their homes.
Thank you so much, and it's of course also a question of sovereignty. Do you guys want to add to that? I mean, there's been quite a lot of points that you have touched on. Maybe also the usage of nukes, as you said. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Not speaking about the part that Putin is an idiot, he's not an idiot. We really need to start to take him seriously and to understand that no, an idiot cannot just be in his position. And that's really important to understand the war and to understand how to finish it. Because if Putin is an idiot, the only solution is just to kill an idiot. And the question about these compromises, it's insanely difficult, of course. It's very painful. And of course, the people may just lynch you if you start to saying that Ukraine must sacrifice parts of its territory for the sake of the humanity in order to prevent the nuclear war with Russia. One of the questions is, for example, how Zelensky, Ukrainian president, would sell it to the part of the mobilized society in Ukraine who would share Hanna's thoughts. Because if he's already sacrificed so many cities' lives, then was it just all in vain? And because you might need some convincing answer to this question. I mean, a part of this answer could be the EU membership for Ukraine, because the EU membership is actually would be very popular within Ukraine, and that would allow Zelensky to present even very difficult results of the negotiations with Russia still as a victory for Ukraine, because we not only sacrificed something because Russia just invaded and we were not able to withstand, and we just had to make some concessions in the face of brutal force. But we've also won something that at least a part of Ukrainians were struggling for since the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. And now that becomes a question to the European elites, specifically to the Austrian elites. Why now they're saying that Ukraine would not be in the European Union, although that would actually be very important for many reasons, not just economic, humanitarian, human rights reasons, and a part of like a realistic negotiations result if we would try to go like this. Also, realistically, we need to understand, as I just emphasized, that in the prospect of the next weeks, it's all about the military balance in Ukraine. The negotiations are basically would depend on the result of how Ukrainian and Russian army would perform, primarily in Donbass, but also in the southern Ukraine. And that would give the arguments to that on another side.
I'm sure you've got to add to that.
Yeah, just one thing. I'm a pedagogue from my education, and dealing with difficult kids is my profession, so to say, that I've learned. If you have a difficult kid in your class and this kid is beating everyone up and stealing candies from them, do you give them the candies? The other thing is, there's this tendency when it comes to Ukraine that people like to play stratego. They say, okay, give these territories to this. What is a bit forgotten about this, or in this sense, is that there are people living on these territories and what they actually want. And no one is actually asking them. It is about them.
Sorry?
But yeah, the point up there, it becomes a much larger question which cannot be answered by like the specific people in there, like in these zones. Like if you're talking about global nuclear rearmament, then it's not about a question of a couple of like 10,000 people living somewhere. If the threat of nuclear war rises exponentially, because like if nukes are used in the Ukraine conflict, we're gonna go from like 8 to 9 countries who have nukes to like 100, and that is the reality we are facing. And like that, there is no does nobody see this like huge discrepancy? Like the US has restrained themselves from becoming or like being the international police force. Like they have completely redacted themselves from that task, and now that's on the table. That's the alternative. Yes, the Ukrainians are winning from a war perspective, but it's like, okay, let them win, but that's the consequence if you're letting them win. Like, if you're completely letting them win. I'm just seeing people digging themselves graves. I'm seeing Zelensky digging himself a grave. I'm seeing Putin somewhat digging himself a grave. Because both are making statements which are not, like, negotiable from both sides. I see President Biden digging himself a grave, calling Putin a war criminal, which basically means, like, if I'm ever going to talk to you, like, I'm going to put you into the Hague and going to try you for war crimes. Like, you can never make any diplomatic solution in such an instance. It's impossible. You cannot talk about anything, and that means we are digging graves, and that means escalation is going to go up to a certain point, and the maximum level of escalation is nukes. It's that simple. And, like, it's going to blow up.
What do you have to say?
But what is to negotiate if the attacker is not even admitting that he attacks? What is there to negotiate? How do you want to talk about something if it's not even clear what you're talking about?
Thank you. I was listening and I had no intention to speak. My name is Yuri Krivanos. I am Ukrainian. I am not a refugee as Hannah, but I am Ukrainian. And I have dealt for 30 years with arms control and disarmament issue. And I also very much interested with history, and I'm trying to analyze the situation we faced these days in Ukraine from the historical point of view. The young man who just said, let us Ukraine win, I would answer, Ukrainian would win without any permission to do so. If you are saying that we should, or somebody may decide to sacrifice part of Ukraine, I would repeat what other colleagues already said. Did you ask those people who live on those territory whether they are ready to give up their territory to somebody? And Ukrainians already sacrifice a lot of life, thousands or 10,000s of life. And this is mainly civilian, women, girls and elderly people. These are destroyed completely cities and towns, and we would never give up. We would never allow Russians military to take over our territory. Now situation is really very difficult. The heavy battles going on, but it doesn't mean that we are prepared to sacrifice our territory in order to avoid a nuclear war. This is a very serious issue about nuclear war. When we speak about nuclear war and nuclear warheads, we should understand what kind of nuclear weapons could be used by Putin. This might be strategic, this might be tactical, this might be minor things. And if he used these weapons in the battlefield in Ukraine, it means that not only Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian soldiers will be affected, Russian soldiers will be affected. It depends on climate situation, on wind. Who may guarantee that this nuclear cloud would not go to Russia? I see you are skeptical. When Chernobyl blew up, this cloud went to Europe. And Sweden first raised a voice that something going wrong in the Soviet Union. Therefore, this is a reason why we have several superpowers, including those with nuclear weapons, who are responsible and who may raise the voice, and they already did, to tell Mr. Putin, don't even think about this. Don't even think about this. And he's blackmailing all society. What you are suggesting about sacrificing Ukraine, sorry, it's not nothing against you, this is about the idea. It happened in 1938, when part of Czech Republic was given up to Hitler. Then he occupied the full territory of Czechoslovakia. Slovakia was his ally. And that eventually resulted in annexation of Austria. And eventually it resulted in the Second World War. And I'm convinced that superpowers, including US, UK, France, Germany, all European Union, as well as China and Pacific countries like Australia and Japan, they do realize the potential consequences of this war. And I'm sure they would not allow Putin to do so. They would not. And my last point, I'm sorry for taking too much time. I would like to come back to the roots of this war. Vladimir mentioned the article by Putin. I even cannot call it article. It's just like an, I don't know what, some kind of piece of paper which... But in this paper, he tried to say that Russian and Ukrainian people are the same. He made very weak attempt to do something similar what second Russian president Leonid Kuchma did when he wrote a book, Ukraine, is not a Russia. And in this book, President Kuchma explained differences and historical roots of Ukrainian people. Putin in 2008 at the Munich Security Conference said for the first time that Ukraine is artificial state. It never existed. Then he wrote this article. Then he even said that it was Lenin's idea who created Ukraine. He is absolutely ignorant in history. I am not talking about Kievan Rus. And I am not talking about the fact that it existed 500 years before Moscow appeared. It is also a fact that on all European maps, Ukraine was called Ukraine. I mean, French, Italian cartographers, they call it Ukraine. But territory around Moscow was called Moscovia. The name of Rus, or Россия, Russia, was stolen by Peter the Great in 1725 when he declared himself as an emperor. And Ukraine fought for its independence in 16th and 17th century and eventually had to sign an agreement with Russia because at that time independence was to a significant extent based on the religion unity. And Ukrainians and Russians were Orthodox, and they are Orthodox. Then Ukraine existed as Ukrainian People Republic from 1917 till 1921. This was a very short period when the Russian Empire disintegrated and there was a chance for Ukraine to create their own state. Unfortunately, Bolsheviks destroyed this state. They destroyed.
I'm very sorry to have to interrupt you.
Then there was attempt during the Second World War and again in 1991. And Ukrainians have a very deep roots and mental strivings for independence. And both Maidans in 2004 and in 2014, it's just a proof and a evidence that Ukrainians are for democratic developments and they would fight for its independence. And they would do this in this war. Many people will die, but I'm sure we will win in this war. And the purpose of our war, to make any peace agreement, not just on the line which Russian troops achieve by today. No, it would be a peace agreement which would bring all Ukrainian territory to the border as they were on 1st January 2014, before the annexation of Crimea and Donbass. By the way, small historical fact, just for your information. When in 1954, within the Soviet Union, was a transfer of Crimea Peninsula to Ukraine, Russia received the best areas with the best agricultural land or soil from Ukraine in Belgorod, Kursk, and Taganrog. This area were Ukraine. I am not talking about more historical things when it was.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your inputs. I just want to give as many people as possible the possibility to bring their questions in, so I'm just going to give Sabrina the chance to speak up.
Actually, the question is also going in the direction you just explained to us. You gave us a very good introduction of the national understanding and about the history and of both sides, of the Ukraine and of Russia. So my question is, and what you discussed before as well, is what is the war going to create in the people, right? So I would ask the panel here, especially Hanna, as well as Volodymyr, as well as Stefan, how do you think the transition is going, especially with the national understanding, because we have on the one side Ukrainians who fight for the country, who feel for the country, who have relatives who are fighting for the country, and then you have Russians who feel that the West is against them because we're having sanctions against them. You have a lot of populism and propaganda there that they're not appreciated, and it's on a very emotional level and not on a topical level. So the question is, how can we create a transition afterwards, and how can we learn from this war which is going on right now?
Whoever wants to answer to that, yeah?
I mean, that's it's like the whole field of study, peacemaking, the reconciliation, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, I'm not exactly an expert in that, because just like people are working their lives on studying which peace agreements did work, which didn't work, how the reconciliation may happen after the brutal wars. But we also know that even after even more horrible wars like the Second World War, now we have Germany, Poland, and France in the European Union, despite the Holocaust, despite all the horrors that Germany inflicted on the whole Europe in that war. But we now understand that, yeah, the people may go back to like peaceful relations. So if the world would survive, of course, at some point in the future, we'll see the kind of like reconciliation or better relations between Ukraine and Russia. But it's just extremely speculative at this point. Another thing that we also need to understand that it's not like Ukrainians on the one side and Russians on the other side, because there are different Ukrainians and there are different Russians. And during the war, of course, it's typically what's happening is polarization is happening. We are divided in camps, and when the country is attacked, it's like a typical effect of unification, rally around the flag, and so on and so forth. But we'll also see that different Ukrainians respond differently to the war. Some are fighting, some are leaving the country, some are waiting to see what happens, unfortunately. Quite many people stayed in the occupied territories in Kherson, in the Zaporizhia region, and now we'll see part of them are protesting, part of them are joining the armed resistance, part of them are now joining the collaborationist structures. Just recently in Kherson, they installed the region administration and city administration, so they found Ukrainians who started to collaborate with the Russians. Like the Ukrainian General Prosecutor Office, by this moment, have already opened about like 10,000 criminal cases on the collaborationist articles. So they find these people. So Ukraine is diverse, and if you are taking Ukraine seriously and not like some cartoon where every Ukrainian thinks the same way, we need to understand that it's a big, complex, diverse country with different reactions. And so it's about Russia as well. So we know from the polls, although they're very dubious, and there's like huge sociological discussion to which extent we actually can trust those polls that show that 60, 70, 80% of Russians support the war. And there are like very sophisticated experiments that show that it's not that simple, but still it's quite a large part of the Russian society that supports the war. But still we also know that there are other Russians, the Russians that left the country, the Russians that joined the anti-war protests, the Russians that are speaking against the war publicly and actually under quite serious danger, which would be inflicted on them in the more and more repressive Russian political regimes. So that also should be kept in mind. And that would be very dangerous to stick to that Ukrainians on one side, Russians on the other side.
Do you guys want to contribute anything to that, or can I move on to the next question? Next one? Okay, there you go.
Hello, thank you very much for your inputs. My name is Marila Huszcze and I work here in the International Institute for Peace. And I have two questions. The first one goes to Hannah. When we read about the European Union's role in the war, when you open news, you often read like EU, implemented sanctions, EU sent weapons to Ukraine, EU supports the president of Ukraine, and so on. My question to you is, how is your family and you yourself perceive the European Union? What does it mean for you? So when you are in Ukraine during the war, what do you think about the European Union? Is it significant for you? Do you hope for some help from the EU? Who do you rely on? What does it mean for you? And before you answer, maybe I will also pose another question to Volodymyr. Because at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned this widespread opinion now that fascism is coming to Russia, and you're not of that opinion, as I understand. But what do you say? Is it possible that this dynamic goes further and it will develop into something like resembling fascism? And now I'm referring to this Z signs, and how already children at schools are used to, form them, and there are pictures, and there is this patriotic sort of drive in education. So what can you say to that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's start off with the first question then.
So I'll be short. Well, definitely from my experience, my relatives, what they do experience now being occupied, and me, I was like forced to flee from my country. We rely on a European Union, because without its help, we won't be able to win this war, won't be able to get this victory, because we are a bit lack of the utilities, so I don't know how to say. Okay, equipment for army, and we're donating a lot. Like me personally, I'm still working in my charitable foundation, so a part of my salary I donate to our army. So we are trying to buy everything what they need, and all people in Ukraine, they are relying on European Union, and they hope that they will help them, because in fact this war is not about Ukraine and peace in Ukraine only. It's like the war in the world.
Let me answer that, please. I'm not supporting the view that something like Russian fascism or Russism is the real cause of this war. I think we can analyze it much more convincingly and more deeper in the rational terms, because it's actually rational for those people who control the power in Russia. But something resembling fascism, and would not necessarily be exactly like those fascisms that we've seen in Germany or Italy and in other European countries in the 1930s. Something resembling that would be the outcome of the war. But in the real fascism, it was more than just a swastika, for example. And that was the massive movement, like thousands, hundreds of thousands, paramilitaries, intellectuals, like many organizations. And the NSDAP was actually not just one party, it was a part of the whole milieu of different parties with which they were competing, but they were all thinking about the outcomes of the First World War, the revenge, the revival of the German nation, and so on and so forth. Nothing like this exists in Russia right now, but some of those elements may be the outcome of the war and something like transformation of the Russian political institutions, creating a more real party from the ruling party in Russia, the United Russia. Now they are seriously starting to compare themselves more and more to China, and like we need to learn from Chinese, who has like a party, who has censorship in the media. That's what Margarita Simonyan just recently were talking about on the Russian television, the director of Russia Today, that we've just lost something that when the Soviet Union collapsed, and now the experience of an ideological state was actually something good that was helping us to withstand the evil Americans. And something like this could go back. And that may resemble in some of the important features the historical fascism. Whether it would go in exactly that direction, I think it's just very long way to go. And it's at the very least, we need to see this as the outcome of the war rather than something that actually caused this war. I'm really very, very skeptical about this idiot, madman, ideological fanatic theory.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move right on to the next question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, working. I'm from the Institute of Danube Region in Central Europe. It was very interesting to listen to the gentleman before. As a matter of fact, Ukrainians are in Ukraine since a long time. In the 19th century, there were movements of Ukrainians. After the First World War, there was this short independence, and after 91, it was, after all, recognized by Russia as well. And since 30 years, there's an independent Ukraine. Now, the one thing is that now Putin says Ukraine doesn't exist as a country. The other thing is when you say even Ukrainians don't exist, and this is exactly what is happening now with the Putin policy. I wonder how it is in Russia, as so many Ukrainians are also living in Russia, or they are married, and there are lots of links that this is taken for granted. It's absurd, and there is also an element, a possible element of genocide then, because when you simply say either the Ukrainians are Russian or they have to be eradicated, and that's what's happening by the military. And we should not forget in Bucha, those military units having killed so many civilians, they are now Garde. They were moving up they were even remunerated, and Mariupol, where people, the thousands, maybe 100,000 are starving to death and have no water. So there are elements of genocide. So I would like to hear from you how you see that. In Russia, there's a lot of propaganda. You don't have any other information anymore, it seems, but it's rather strange. The other thing is that, of course, it's not only Ukraine. Yesterday it started that in Transnistria there are some problems suddenly starting. So it could be that Russia is interested that units in Transnistria of Moldavia are also entering. So the next country is involved, and then you will have the Baltics and you will have Poland. So it's continuing. So we must hope that the Ukrainians are going to win. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input. Do you have anything to say to that, or you, Stefan, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah.
You can just
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to add that I think the Third Reich didn't start with the 1943 version of the Third Reich. It started slowly. I think the question what started this war is if it was ideology or if it was a rational idea behind it, so to say. I think does it matter? As you've said before, I mean, there are elements of genocide here. If you say you people don't exist, it means you shouldn't exist. That's all I just want to add.
Okay, do you want to add something?
I think that Putin's goal is not exactly to exterminate Ukrainians, but rather to re-educate Ukrainians into another version of Ukrainian identity. To explain them, I mean, one of Ukrainian journalists actually said a very smart thing. A Ukrainian is a Russian who doesn't believe Putin, at least in Putin's perspective. So Putin sees Ukrainians as Russians fundamentally, because like the single people who just don't agree with his version of history. And so the idea of something like a genocide, if we are speaking about this, that would be about so-called re-education. And in this perspective, we should see, for example, some of the signs when there have been reports that they're going to invite the school teachers in Kherson region to go to Crimea and to learn how to teach in the schools from the Crimean teachers according to the Russian programs. So I think that's much more to the actual plans of Russia rather than to like exterminate Ukrainians like Nazis were exterminated Jews in the Second World War. So that was genocide. That's I mean, some social scientists do not use this category, but this is a real legal category. I would not go into that discussion because it's just not my field of science. But I would rather call to be careful with these comparisons. I mean, when we say it is a genocide, with what exactly we are comparing what's going on in Ukraine? With the Holocaust? With the genocide of the indigenous population in the Northern America, in Australia? Or with what kind of genocide? With something that would happen in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Turkey against Armenians.
But why do you have to compare it? I'm sorry.
But why then we are using this category?
No,
then?
but if a state news agency is reporting or is publishing articles where it's written that everyone who identifies him or herself as a Ukrainian is a target.
No, they say not exactly this.
And everyone who is fighting has to be eliminated. I'm sorry, that's RIA Novosti.
No, what those news agencies were publishing, that now Ukraine would turn into something like Malorussia. Malorussia is the version of Ukrainian identity. It's, yeah, from the Russian side, the imperial project that existed in the 19th century, that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are three branches of the same people. That's about re-education, how Ukrainians are supposedly to feel about themselves as a part of some general unity with Russians. It's, I mean, we can say that they don't have any right, because Ukrainians may identify themselves as whatever they want to. They may identify themselves against Russia, they may identify themselves in a different way. There are indeed different identities that Ukrainians are having, and we know that Ukrainians have also have been feeling about Russia in a different way. Even before the invasion started. In 2016, Ukrainian polling company found that about like 25% of Ukrainians actually were saying that, yes, Ukrainians and Russians are one people, literally. And 56% said that Ukrainians and Russians are so-called brotherly people, like different, but still very, very much related. That was 2016, that was after Crimea, after Donbass. So there was this opinion in Ukraine. So, I mean, that's a very difficult discussion, and I would call to be very careful about the use of very strong words like genocide, because that leads to very strong consequences.
Thank you. Before I give the word to you, I just ask, because we have 10 minutes left, to be as brief as possible, so that we may have maybe a last question from the audience. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Genocide is the international destruction of the people, usually defined as an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. You don't have to be part of the same country. It can be one country against another. So that term genocide does fit in this situation.
Thank you. Thank you for this definition. Maybe you want to continue and pick up on that?
Yeah, I would like to continue this very interesting discussion because it's very interesting point. And I would say we have to understand what was first and what was second, what was a reason and what was consequences. Volodymyr, perhaps you read publication by Mr. Timofey Sergeytsev in RIA Novosti, and he explained what is denazification. Denazification was one of the purposes officially declared by Putin on 24th February 2022. Reason of the war: denazification, demilitarization, and rejection to join NATO by Ukraine. According to Mr. Sergeytsev, who published this in RIA Novosti, it's a state news department or agency, he explained denazification means elimination of Ukrainians as a nation and elimination Ukraine as a state. Yes, it means that you either will be killed or you should agree and say, yes, I am Russian. And it doesn't mean which language people in Ukraine speak. We have Switzerland, people speak 3 or even 4 languages. We have Canada, people speak 2 languages. It's not a question, it's just a manipulation. The point is what is in mind of these people. And the main problem of this war and the main problem of Russian people is propaganda, is Russian propaganda. This Putin did from the very beginning of his term in the office. He eliminated all independent news agency. He subordinated everything to Kremlin. And all of them say the same on different channels. And all these propagandists, Solovyov, Skabeyeva, Simonyan, which you mentioned, and many others, they receive big money. They receive big money. Where he takes this money, I mean Putin, in 2003, when Americans started the war against Iraq, and oil prices rocketed from $18 per barrel to eventually to $150 per barrel. This is a golden reign. Russia did nothing. Putin did nothing. He didn't improve his economy, but he received a lot of oil dollars and then gas dollars. And he used these dollars to modernize his army and in order to pay propagandists who believe that Ukraine is a Nazi state. And as we won the Second World War and defeated fascism, we will do the same with Ukraine, period. This is a purpose and this is a result of this propaganda.
Thank you for that input. We just have a few minutes left. We have like 7 to 8 minutes left, so I'll just hand it over to you.
I'll try to make a couple of points. Yes, there are nukes, as a physicist I can say, which are very effective and very constrained in their area of effect. Secondly, what did I want to say? Yes, we are not talking, like, if that has come over the wrong way, I'm trying to limit as much human life lost as possible. Like, the Russians have not shown themselves in their most brutal way. Like, maybe they're showing themselves in Mariupol, but everywhere else they basically used gloves and did not really pull them off, because there is so much heavy artillery from the Soviet era. Like, they could probably level every single city on their way to Lviv, and like, they used sparing pain. Yes, if you escalate that, nah, it's not going to be funny. And we're not talking then about 20,000, 100,000 casualties, we're going to the millions. That is not what should be done. And it's quite obvious that participators in a war can't really negotiate. And that's another fact, unless both are completely bled dry. And it's even more obvious right here. I will probably buy wheat ETFs at some point after this discussion, because it's quite obvious that this will take a long, long time, and the prices are going to skyrocket after this. Yeah. It feels kind of, everybody seems to be missing the point. Like, we're not talking about winning here, we are talking about how do we precisely outmaneuver this crisis before it completely blows up in our faces. And I don't feel like it's being get here in any way, point or form.
Thank you. Because we have 5 minutes left, I'd ask you to ask your question shortly, and then I'll move on to our experts and give them just a few words of conclusion.
Yeah, a little bit building on his point. So I think the problem stated that we need like a face-saving way out for the parties to end the war in a somehow diplomatic way should be done. I don't agree with your conclusions in the end, but my question would be, are there any things that Putin could get that's like popular in Russia, like for example EU membership is popular in Ukraine, that he could get that could help him have a face-saving exit without like conquering additional provinces or stuff like that? And additionally, would there be ways to create new stakes in the game which could then be given back in order to make Putin look like he has a win? For the second point, for example, when the Soviet Union placed nukes in Cuba, they created a new situation, and then it was like a win for Kennedy to get those nukes off, even though like he just got back to the status quo. So could we create situations like this, not with nukes obviously, which could help Russia and Putin get out face-saving, and so end the war without obviously Ukraine losing, which is something I think nobody here wants.
Who wants to start answering this question and also make their final conclusions? Maybe we can start right here. No final words, conclusions, answer. Yeah.
I'll just answer this question. The face-saving boundaries are changing. In the beginning of the war, the goal was clearly something like regime change in Ukraine. Now, when that didn't work, apparently, they were discussing neutrality, something like demilitarization, in some specific terms, how much of Ukrainian army Russia would be okay with. Whatever they call denazification, and the most difficult questions were about Crimea and Donbass. And even at that point, the Russian position was that Donbass would be like all theirs, not just on how it was on February 24, with part of Donbass controlled by so-called People's Republics, but the whole administrative regions in Ukraine. Now, with what we are seeing is happening in Kherson and Melitopol, in the occupied south of Ukraine, it looks like it's not only about Donbass, it's also about that part of Ukraine as well, at least. And now, yeah, you probably read reports that the goals of the second stage is just to go to Transnistria, that means occupation of Nikolaev, Odessa, probably Kharkov as well. So the face-saving ways for Putin without some conquer of territory in Ukraine probably doesn't exist at this moment. But we also need to understand that it all depends on the battlefield.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, thanks.
No, you can go on.
Yeah, but the face-saving exits, I completely agree. I mean, the offer is on the table. It's a neutrality with guarantees. It's Donbass. I mean, the occupied territories in Donbass and Crimea dealt with separately. no response from the Russian side, but the threat to Transnistria. About the appeasement approach, I mean, 2014, this was actually being done. During the Minsk talks, Russia was sitting there as a negotiator and not as a conflict party. Where has it led to? I mean, I completely agree there needs to be some way out of this and life-saving way out of this. But appeasement evidently wasn't the way, because this directly has led into this situation now.
Thank you so much. And that also, do you want to give any last words? Okay. Okay. So then I will just wrap up this discussion now. Our time is up, unfortunately. And I'd just like to thank our great speakers and also the audience for being part of this event. And I also wish to extend our gratitude to the IAP for hosting us here and for our ongoing cooperation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And before I now release you to make your way to have some drinks and snacks over at the bar, we just want to give our experts some tokens of our appreciation. And yeah, thank you again so much.